I'm very thankful for the chance to be participating in this discussion. Clearly, it's a provocative discussion. It raises a lot of questions, and I want to speak to you guys today from a standpoint of what I learned when I was studying at USC, which was empathy. As a theater major, my primary objective was to challenge myself to see if I could put myself in somebody else's shoes and realistically think through and feel through what it might be like to be another person, right? Somebody other than myself. To me, that's where I come from in my interactions, and when I interacted with Sergeant Parker that day, it was, it was basically one of those situations where you've spent your whole life trying to be politically correct, trying to be, to make your family proud, trying to make your community proud. When I was at USC, I worked 2 jobs to get myself through school. I was a student representative at the Office of Admissions, so I was always representing, sort of my place here at USC as a minority student, right? That I have a right to be here, right? I've worked hard as a resident advisor, which I was already all through school so that I could afford to stay in school. It was a lot of that. Let's do programs that help people understand what it's like to be a member of what we call a marginalized group. What does that mean? How can we talk about this in a way that doesn't piss people off? If there's a racial conflict on the dorm floor, how can we address this in a way that makes the people who are concerned about being seen as racist, make them feel okay, right? And how can we also make the students who are feeling marginalized and the students who are feeling oppressed and feeling invisible and feeling like they don't have a voice, how can we make them also a part of the conversation? I come from a very, what you might say, unstable childhood. My parents divorced when I was young. I moved around a lot. I was constantly changing schools. I was constantly trying to see how I could fit myself into the cultural dynamic of the environment that I found myself in, right? And I bring that up because education was very important to my parents, right? My mom is from Jamaica, and she moved here to get a better education. My dad grew up in Watts in the 60s when, there were still separate bathrooms, there was riots. My dad lived in Mississippi in the 60s when you could be killed for being a black and white couple. Just really, someone could be angry and decide that they wanted to, get rid of you, sort of that, and that happened, and we don't talk about that a lot, right? That's something that we like to say, okay, we have a black president, like, these issues of race, don't talk about them, like, it just makes people uncomfortable, right? And so I grew up, with my mother as a Jamaican immigrant, or not immigrant, but she had a green card. I'm legal, don't worry. But, coming here for education, being the only black girl in all white private schools, right? And my mom, when I was like 7 years old, she said to me, because I came home crying one day because all of the white girls had been talking in class, and then I was the one that got in trouble, right? And, we all have things like this when we're little, like, it could be anything, right? It's because you have red hair, because you have a big nose, whatever. But I just happened to be the black girl that got in trouble quite a bit for what I felt like wasn't a fair reason. And I remember my mom explaining to me, and I was like 7, and it just made such an impact on me. She was like, Danielle, I love you, you're awesome, but you have to understand that you have to work twice as hard to not get in trouble, right? You have to work twice as hard to get what the other white girls in your class are going to just get handed to them, because people are threatened by your blackness. You're the only black girl in the class. People are threatened by that. They see criminals on TV, they see prostitutes on TV, you know, they see these images and they go, oh, are we getting one of those people in our school, right? Like on some level, that was the environment that I grew up in. So I worked very hard to, you know, do everything I could to present myself in a way that wouldn't threaten people, right? That would just, I'm not going to be the angry black woman here, you know, I'm going to be the person that helps mediate this conflict, that helps bring us together. But when I interacted with Sergeant Parker on September 11th, it had been not the first time, not the second time, not the third time. It had been the fourth time since I had shaved my head that a police officer had been called because there was suspicious activity, and gone about questioning my partner Brian and I based on that assumption of suspicious activity. Now, I wrote about this in my LA Times essay, and I only have a minute left, so I won't go too much into it, but one of those times I was, we were sorting through his dad's garage in Loma Linda, which is where I was born, and he's also from there. And somebody called the police saying that a suspicious black and white couple was loitering the area, and that there may have been a potential robbery. So when so when the police officer arrived, and again, the time in Loma Linda had been the third time, right? So the first two times, you know, I gave my ID, you know, tried to be as gracious as possible. I tried to, you know, go along with it the second time, same thing. Even outside of the police, my mom was having surgery a few months back, and we had to go to the hospital early in the morning, and I had gone out to the courtyard to get some air, and I had fallen asleep, and I woke up with a security guard standing over me saying, ma'am, what's in your cup? So my boyfriend's a raw food chef, I had green juice in my cup, right? But apparently somebody had called the hospital security at the Christian hospital saying that there was a drunk in the courtyard. And the security officer was trying to actively escort me out of the hospital. So I burst into tears. I explained to him, my mom's having surgery, I'm very stressed. Perhaps your first line of inquiry might be to ask if I was okay, right? You know, but again, these are all sort of swimming in my identity, in my emotional body. When I talked to Sergeant Parker that day, also swimming in my emotional body was watching on the news, you know, Ferguson, talking to my dad about all of these things on the news that had been coming up. Black man gets shot for reaching for his ID. You know, these things, like, are we, you know, in the 60s? Like, I can't, it was hard for me, you know, all of this has been hard for me to digest, and I've been trying to just, like, okay, you know, be gracious, approach this in a way that's civil. But when Sergeant Parker approached me that day, actually he didn't approach me, he approached Brian and asked Brian for my ID. Now, to some people that may not seem like a big deal. For me, having experienced what I just described, for the officer not even to give me the dignity of addressing me and explaining what happened, for him to make the assumption that it was okay to speak to the male there, the white male there, things that I'd like to say, no, we're beyond this, it doesn't matter, but again, all of these things stirring in my emotional body by the time I got to that day, that Thursday, it was upsetting. Now, I was on the phone talking to my dad. You know, as I said in many interviews and to the officer there, we were making out. There was no nudity. We haven't done anything wrong. In that moment, it seemed like none of that mattered, because what mattered was that, what you can hear Sergeant Parker say on the police audio, she needs to learn that she doesn't dictate what happens. That dynamic is what I experienced, and as much as I wanted to just make it easier for everyone, at a certain point I think enough is enough and you have to say something. So the anger that you see me expressing, the frustration, the feelings of desperation or of invisibility, it had reached a point where I couldn't repress that any longer. Langston Hughes has a poem, it's one of my favorite poems, it's called Harlem, and it goes, what happens to a dream deferred? Do you guys have that one? So you know, does it dry up like a sugary sweet, he goes through all these things, and the last thing he says, or does it explode, right? So that day, yes, I exploded, right? There was an explosion, but if we're going to condemn me, then we also have to look at the entire society that I am a product of, right? We get to look in these discussions with these beautiful professors and you beautiful people who want to have this discussion. We get to look at why this is the way it is, and we get to examine it and become more aware of it. So I really appreciate you guys joining me in this. And as I said from the beginning, for me, empathy, we can learn what it might be like to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I will say this, and I know I'm almost done, but you know, people have, on the internet, you know, they get really excited. And so I've been getting quite a lot of interesting comments on my Facebook wall. Everything from, you're a prostitute, get back to walking the streets where you belong, this is why we call you niggers, she should be horsewhipped. Somebody telling Brian he might as well just hang himself, these sorts of things, right? And one of the other things is that you must be a cop hater. You must be a cop hater, right? You know, these race-baiting cop haters, right? I want to acknowledge that I do believe cops have a tough job, right? They have to mediate conflict. They have to deal with people who are upset and try and diffuse situations. And that is why I think these discussions are important, because for those officers who may not have understood why a black woman would be upset in a situation like this, right? That's understandable. Maybe they don't, you know, haven't experienced that. Maybe they didn't grow up like I did, right? For those officers, we can begin to start this dialogue that hopefully we can all benefit from, and we can become more aware. So, you know, I just want to acknowledge the police officers, you know, who, you know, friends, your families, those who are listening, you know, because I do feel like it is a difficult job, but I do think discussions like this can help us all have greater compassion and understanding and empathy and awareness. So I appreciate you guys having me, and I look forward to the questions, because I think that's where, you know, again, the dialogue happens, and we get to get clear about what kind of society we all want to live in.